This is Guy McPherson. I'm Professor Emeritus of Conservation Biology at the University of Arizona. I'm coming to you today from Central Florida. I'm often asked, what shall we do? By my students for 21 years in the classroom, I provided advice, suggestions, and even graded their output. I'm not going to do that for you. As Homer pointed out in the Iliad, any moment might be our last. Everything is more beautiful because we are doomed. The paragraph before this one, Homer described the gods and why they are jealous of humans. They are jealous of humans because the gods are forced to live forever. There's no point in stopping to smell the proverbial flowers, or even the real ones, if there are going to be millions of years worth of flowers ahead. You will never be lovelier than you are now. We will never be here again. It's not true for the gods, according to Homer in the Iliad. Rather, because our times are short, we get to experience the urgency of living as if time is short. We get to appreciate every flower that we stop to smell. We are in the midst of a pandemic. We are in the midst of a mass extinction event. We are in the midst of abrupt, irreversible climate change. I'll describe each of those in turn. COVID-19 is the disease resulting from the novel coronavirus that has been described to us in various media outlets over the last month or so. And such an outcome as the one we are experiencing has been predicted and described for many years. As a minor example, and I'm not an epidemiologist, so this is a minor example, these words come from a commencement address to the Master of Public Health program at the University of Arizona, where I was still on campus in August of 2007. I was describing the four horsemen of the apocalypse in this presentation for the graduating students in the Master of Public Health program. I indicated that, quote, we'll also see pestilence as one of the four horsemen, what we call disease when it happens one person at a time, making a big comeback. In other words, the events we're seeing play out now have been described in the literature and discussed amongst real epidemiologists and other scientists for really quite a long time. We are in the midst of what is called the Anthropocene mass extinction event, named after us. A mass extinction event is defined as one in which more than 50% of the species on Earth go extinct. There have been 6 previous extinction events in which more than 50% of the species went extinct, and they are described here, at least with respect to when they began and the names we have assigned to them. Notice that I've highlighted the Permian event some 252 million years ago, and also the Anthropocene, the ongoing event. Most people have described the current mass extinction event as the 6th, but it's actually the 7th. It was only the late Guadalupean, the third one shown here, was only described in the peer-reviewed literature within the last few years. So we are actually in the midst of the 7th mass extinction event. It's called the Anthropocene because we are the ones driving it, the people. And it is most similar to the Permian event, which caused the extinction of about 95% of the species on Earth. The ongoing event is similar to the Permian with one exception. The current event is proceeding about an order of magnitude faster than the Permian event, and also it is driving to extinction species about 10 times faster. So the rate of environmental change, the rate of greenhouse gases being poured into the atmosphere, and the rate of extinctions is about an order of magnitude faster in the ongoing Anthropocene extinction event than it was during the worst of them all so far, the Permian. That event, in other words, is being eclipsed grotesquely by the ongoing mass extinction event. As conservation biologists, Ceballos and colleagues, including Paul Ehrlich, also a conservation biologist. So we have 2 conservation biologists as the first 2 authors of both of these papers. Ceballos and Ehrlich and colleagues described in June 2015 in the peer-reviewed journal Science Advances, We're in the midst of accelerated modern human-induced species losses. That's why this ongoing mass extinction event is called the Anthropocene, because it's human-induced. And note that this was June in 2015 in the peer-reviewed literature, and they indicated we are entering the sixth mass extinction. By this time, there had been articles and books written about the ongoing mass extinction event for about a decade. And this is just an indication of how conservative and slow to respond the peer-reviewed literature is. Coincident with release of the paper in Science Advances, Ceballos in an interview said life would take many millions of years to recover, and our species itself would likely disappear early on. A second paper in 2017 by Ceballos and colleagues in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, another peer-reviewed journal, indicates something I had never previously seen before in the peer-reviewed literature: biological annihilation. I had never previously seen the word annihilate or annihilation in the title of a peer-reviewed paper. Consistent with that, with the use of that word annihilation in the title of the paper, conservation biologist Paul Ehrlich points out that we're toxifying the entire planet. This in an interview conducted coincident with the release of the paper. So we're in the midst of a mass extinction event in 2017. That was about 3 years ago. Let's take a look at how it's playing out. What's important in all mass extinction events, and particularly the ongoing one, is the rate of environmental change. Quintero and Wiens, in their peer-reviewed paper in Ecology Letters, pointed out in 2013, nearly 7 years ago now, that the rates of projected climate change dramatically exceed past rates of climate niche evolution among vertebrate species. Well, we are vertebrates. This rate of change is based on the very slow projected rate of change forecast by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. And in fact, compared to that rate of change, projecting to 2100, would require rates of niche evolution that are more than 10,000 times faster than rates typically observed among species. In other words, the rate of change is proceeding more than 5 orders of magnitude faster than previously observed rates of change, and the inability of vertebrates to keep up is what is the important part of this paper published nearly 7 years ago. Davis and colleagues, in a paper in the peer-reviewed Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in October of 2018, mammal diversity will require millions of years to recover from the current biodiversity crisis. That's the title of the thing. And in the paper, Davis and colleagues indicate, quote, we use a birth-death tree framework to show that even if extinction rates slow to pre-anthropogenic background levels, and I don't imagine a situation in which that could happen, recovery will likely take millions of years. So again, we're seeing this idea of millions of years for recovery rooted in the peer-reviewed literature. We are in the midst of something that has occurred in planetary history, but never this fast. We're in the midst of something called abrupt, irreversible climate change. Consider, for example, Dan Coates, the director of national intelligence during the Trump administration at the time, pointed out in February of 2018, in fact went to Capitol Hill to warn about abrupt climate change. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, perhaps one of the most conservative scientific bodies in the history of the planet, indicated in September 2019 that climate change is irreversible. That's a direct quote. Climate change is irreversible. And of course, this is, again, among the most conservative scientific bodies in the history of our planet, and certainly in the history of our species. Climate change is irreversible. They attribute that irreversibility to the warming of the oceans. Human animals, as with all other species on Earth, require habitat to survive. I turned to the Merriam-Webster online dictionary for a simple definition of habitat that will do for the purposes of this presentation. Habitat, according to Merriam and Webster, is the place or environment where a plant or animal naturally or normally lives and grows. So let's think about that for a minute. Do humans normally or naturally live and grow on, say, the International Space Station? Or in a nuclear submarine? No, of course not. We can survive in those environments, but only because food is provided from another place. We grow the food, we put it in cans, and then we can persist in nuclear submarines for quite a while. But once we lose habitat here on Earth, as with any other species, shortly thereafter the last individual of our species will disappear. We do not naturally or normally live and grow on the International Space Station. Instead, we do that here on Earth. We depend upon habitat here on Earth for our own survival. Extinction results from the loss of habitat. So if we're losing habitat, and we are, for our species and many others, then at some point we will lose all of our habitat and we will go extinct. Consider the European Strategy and Policy Analysis Systems report that came out in April 2019, forecasting trends to 2030 and indicating that an increase of 1.5 degrees, that's 1.5 degrees Celsius, above the 1750 baseline. That's the maximum the planet can tolerate. Should temperatures increase further beyond that 1.5 degrees Celsius above the 1750 baseline, we will face even more droughts, floods, extreme heat, and poverty, and at worst, the extinction of humankind altogether. That sounds pretty bad. So it sounds like we better not go above 1.5 degrees Celsius above the 1750 baseline. How inconvenient then that at the time, Earth was at least 1.73 degrees Celsius above the 1750 baseline, going back to nearly 2 years before that paper was published by the European Strategy and Policy Analysis System. That, at the time, the 1.7 degrees and change, was the highest global average temperature ever experienced by Homo sapiens on Earth. This according to the peer-reviewed paper by James Hansen and colleagues. And then, in February of this year, 2020, Earth eclipsed the much ballyhooed 2 degrees Celsius above the 1750 baseline. As I indicated, our extinction will result from the loss of habitat for human animals, Homo sapiens, on planet Earth. I'm going to describe very briefly the McPherson paradox, which I didn't name, was named by a friend and online supporter of mine by the name of Bill Eddy. I had been describing this phenomenon, this paradox, for a few years at this point, indicating that continued industrial activity further heats the planet. And of course, we are warned about this all the time. We hear about greenhouse gases warming the planet, but what we almost never hear about is that decreased industrial activity will heat the planet even faster. We constantly are reminded that we must reduce industrial activity and therefore reduce greenhouse gases if we are to save our species. That's not quite the whole story. First of all, let's look at civilization as a heat engine. As described by Tim Garrett at the University of Utah, an atmospheric scientist there, global warming is the outcome of this set of living arrangements. It matters not at all, according to the work by Tim Garrett, whether we power civilization through wind turbines and solar panels, wave power and so on, whether we power it that way or if we power it with fossil fuels. Either way, civilization is a heat engine. The way we live, the way we run this civilization, even if we switch overnight to wind turbines and solar panels, civilization itself is a heat engine that is heating the planet. How fast? Burke and colleagues in the peer-reviewed journal Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences indicate, quote, our study suggests that climates like those of the Pliocene will prevail as soon as 2030, current era, and persist under climate stabilization scenarios. Their conclusion of Pliocene-style climate, 2 to 3 degrees Celsius warmer than today, which is a very rapid rate of change, their conclusion was based on the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's representative concentration pathways. These RCPs have been constantly shown to be too conservative with respect to how rapidly the planet is heating up right now. So even based on this very conservative analysis, based on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's representative concentration pathways, we're still headed for a Pliocene-style climate as early as 2030. So what about reduced industrial activity causing even more rapid heating? Most of us know that global warming results from greenhouse gases such as water vapor, carbon dioxide, and methane in the atmosphere. These greenhouse gases trap the heat once the planet is heated up. So solar radiation comes in, strikes the Earth, heats the planet up, and some of the long-wave radiation does not exit the atmosphere. Some of it gets trapped, much like a greenhouse or your car on a sunny day sitting out in the parking lot. Some of that long-wave radiation gets trapped and heats the Earth. How much? To about 2 degrees Celsius, so far above the 1750 baseline. That's a tremendously huge amount. And that's a result of these many greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. What if we reduce industrial activity? That sounds like it would be a good idea. In fact, that's what we hear all the time from climate scientists and the media, the corporate media, is that we need to reduce our industrial activity. But if we do, we then lose the aerosols produced through industrial activity. They contribute to what's called the aerosol masking effect, or sometimes called global dimming. I suspect you can find still online the 2005 BBC video indicating that global dimming was occurring even then, and they indicated how rapidly the aerosol masking effect is lost when industrial activity ceases or is diminished. That's because these aerosols are produced through industrial activity. It's not just greenhouse gases, it's these aerosols. These aerosols go into the atmosphere and they act as something of an umbrella, deflecting incoming sunlight from even striking the Earth so the Earth can't warm up. They act as mirrors or umbrellas that bounce the sunlight back out into space before it gets to come in and warm up the planet. So no need to worry about the long-wave radiation getting trapped by greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide. If the planet never warms up, then we don't need to worry about it, right? But in fact, these aerosols are produced through industrial activity every day, and as a consequence, the planet is kept cooler. This aerosol masking effect plays out over a course of 5 days, according to James Hansen, and about 6 weeks, according to other climate scientists. So the aerosols are constantly falling out of the atmosphere. The planet heats up in as little as 5 days or 6 weeks, neither of which is too rapid for most species on the planet to keep up. As little as 35% reduction in industrial activity will contribute to a 1 degree Celsius global average temperature rise. This according to a paper by Levy and colleagues in the peer-reviewed literature, the Journal of Geophysical Research Atmospheres, some 7 years ago. According to a recent paper, February 2019, by Rosenfeld and colleagues, quote, the measured aerosol cloud-mediated cooling effect was much larger than the present estimates. So what they are writing is that the cooling effect was much larger than present estimates, including the paper they cited by Levy and colleagues, and also a paper they cited by James Hansen and colleagues, published in December 2011. So, how much larger? The paper is ambiguous. The paper by Rosenfeld and colleagues is ambiguous about how much larger was the aerosol masking effect than previous estimates. But in an interview conducted with Rosenfeld by Sustainability Times shortly before that paper came out, Sustainability Times writes, quote, the cooling impact of the aerosol particles, much of which is pollution that humans have been pumping into the atmosphere, is nearly twice what scientists previously thought. So as a consequence, the paper by Rosenfeld and colleagues, citing the paper by Rosenfeld et al. From 2013, suggests that a reduction of industrial activity by as little as 20%, as little as turning down the dial of industrial activity, only 20%, will trigger a 1 degree Celsius global average temperature rise. I suspect that we are already experiencing that temperature rise as a result of reduced industrial activity that has followed the COVID-19 response. We haven't experienced it yet, we haven't noticed it yet, because it happened at exactly the right time for human habitat. It happened during winter and spring, and so the loss of aerosols did not affect crop productions from last year, did not influence trees leafing out yet, because that's based on carbohydrates stored last year. And so I suspect we will soon see a dramatic biological and ecological response to this rapid rise in temperature that is already being reported due to this loss of aerosol masking. Indeed, if a 20% reduction in industrial activity triggers a 1 degree Celsius temperature rise, then COVID-19 might cause the extinction of humans, and as a result, all life on Earth. Let me describe why that might be so. That 2017 paper by Ceballos and colleagues was the first time I had ever seen the word annihilate or annihilation in a peer-reviewed article. Scientists are just typically too conservative to use words like annihilate in their titles. And yet here we see, November 13th, 2018, a paper by Strone and Bradshaw. Bradshaw is a conservation biologist, by the way. Strone is a biologist. The title is Co-Extinctions Annihilate Planetary Life. And they're talking about all planetary life during extreme environmental change. And they described extreme environmental change as a 5 to 6 degrees Celsius global average temperature rise. Again, this is in the peer-reviewed literature. We are headed for that 5 or 6 degree global average temperature rise very quickly as a result of environmental activity, or even more quickly as a result of reduced industrial activity. So I think we're in this situation where we're going to lose all life on Earth. And I'm completely ignoring the catastrophic meltdown of 450 and change nuclear power plants. I'm just relying upon Strone and Bradshaw, and this quote tells it all from senior author, lead author Strone in the paper in an interview released the day after the paper came out. Quote, "Our paper demonstrates that even the most tolerant species ultimately succumb to extinction when the less tolerant species on which they depend disappear." He couldn't have been pointing more clearly to humans. We depend upon many, many organisms, some of them very small, for a myriad reasons. They filter our water, so they provide us with clean water. They pollinate our food. They decompose plant matter so that it breaks down and turns into soil so that we can grow more food, and so on. In addition, the less tolerant species on which we depend, and many other species do as well, include things like the gut flora in our own guts, in our own stomachs. And if you think small things don't matter, just upset one of those species in your stomach for a short period of time and tell me how well that's going to work out for you. Small things matter a lot. So it looks like we're headed for the extinction of all life on Earth as a result of the rapid rate of environmental change. And that can result either from ongoing rapid climate change or a diminution of the aerosol masking effect, as both of which are described in the peer-reviewed literature as occurring very rapidly and likely to occur very rapidly into the future, no matter what we do. And I already mentioned that it could also result from the catastrophic uncontrolled meltdown of the 450 and change nuclear power plants around the world that would leave us bathing in ionizing radiation. The lethal mutations resulting from such an event would leave us in a very unhappy place and ultimately would cause loss of all life on Earth. So then, the question arises, the question that I posed to my students for 21 years in the classrooms: what shall we do? What is worth doing? If we know we're going to die, and shortly after birth all of us know that we're going to die as individuals, then how shall we act? If our life is short, and all the evidence indicates that our lives are indeed short, then what shall we do? Again, turning to Homer, any moment might be our last. I encourage people to live with urgency, recognizing that everything is more beautiful because our time here is short. Everything. That includes the most mundane of tasks, like taking out the garbage, something I enjoyed that I used to hate, because I know that any time I take out the garbage might be my last. For some people, action is the antidote to despair, as described by Edward Abbey, the desert anarchist, many years ago in his writing. He also wrote that sentiment without action is the ruin of the soul. So he promotes the idea of acting, and so do I, even if the actions are known to not improve the situation for our species. I would argue that if your actions, what a Buddhist might call right actions, if those actions benefit the people in your life, the people around you in the very small circle that you occupy, your family, your friends, your community, then that's the right action to take. That's the action that is the antidote to despair. As Viktor Frankl pointed out in his 1946 book, Man's Search for Meaning, between a stimulus and a response, there is a space. In that space is the power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. The last of human freedoms is to choose one's attitude in any set of circumstances. And I would also add on to that the last of human freedoms is to choose one's actions as well as attitude in any set of circumstances. I would argue that I'm providing the stimulus that has been provided by many writers and speakers over the last 100 years or so, that your life is short. Of course your life is short. We've all known that since shortly after we were born. And yet, we act many times as if we have a long run ahead of us. I would argue that we don't have a long run as individuals or as a species. And so, how do we respond? The last of human freedoms is to choose one's attitude, and I would argue actions, in any set of circumstances. I don't think this character on the left is what Frankl had in mind. Life is short. Make sure you spend as much time as possible on the internet arguing with strangers about politics or anything else. You can do that. I have no control over your actions or your attitude. What I choose to do, as indicated by the panel on the right, is to live with gratitude every day, to dance. And there have been many communities of human beings that, realizing they are doomed by the oncoming slaughter of enemy humans, have chosen instead to dance literally over a cliff of extinction. I'm not suggesting that I'm dancing because we're literally at the cliff of extinction, but we're close. And my response is to dance and to treat with kindness the people around me and to live with gratitude in the short time I have left. Emerson pointed out that the purpose of life is not to be happy. It is to be useful, to be honorable, to be compassionate, to have it make some difference that you have lived, and lived well. This is a picture from a little over a year ago, taken with a former student of mine. I hadn't seen her for 18 years since she took my conservation biology course. Through many moves and many disruptions in her life, she retained the piece of art that she had created in that classroom 18 years earlier. She held on to it through all those moves and all those disruptions of her family because it served as a guidepost for her, an architectural plan, as it were, for how to live her life. So, I would argue, consistent with Emerson, that the purpose of life is not to be happy, it is to be useful. And I would further argue that in choosing useful actions on my part, I also made myself happy. I couldn't have been happier than seeing Mary for the first time in 18 years after she completed that class. I couldn't have been happier than see her still carrying around that piece of art that she had conducted those many years earlier and pointing out to me that it serves as a guidepost for how to live for her. I continue to pursue actions. Obviously, most of them these days are remote actions or recordings such as this one, including, for example, presentations like this one, as shown in the top panel, interviews, as shown in the lower left, and potentially someday again, starting up the Only Love Remains workshop that I created with my partner. And will we do that remotely one day? Perhaps. And if through some miracle we get through this coronavirus situation, then perhaps we'll be offering it in person again as well. Thank you very much for the opportunity to chat with you today. I very much appreciate it. You can find all of my work at GuyMcPherson.com.